The anomaly lasted 11 seconds. The Enterprise D was 3 light hours from the edge of the Maxia Zeta system, running a routine stellar survey, when its sensor array registered a gravimetric distortion that the computer could not classify. Not a quantum singularity. Not the subspace resonance signature of Romulan technology, or the exotic matter profile of a Cardassian weapons test, or any of the 47 categories of spatial phenomenon that 2 centuries of Federation deep space exploration had defined, named, and filed. The distortion simply bent space without apology, held for 11 seconds, and then closed. Like a wound that had healed before anyone could look at it, the sensors swept the affected coordinates. Then the long-range array returned a contact that Lieutenant Commander Data reviewed twice before bringing to the bridge, not because he doubted the instruments, because the reading was something he had no prior category for, and he wanted to be precise when he described it. Kal-El came back to himself in the dark between stars. He knew vacuum. He had flown the outer reaches of his own solar system more times than he could count, had held position between Earth and Mars, just to think, had let the cold and silence settle over him when he needed the universe to stop being loud. He was not afraid of the void, but this void was wrong in a way that took him 3 full seconds to identify, and in his experience, 3 seconds was a long time. A fraction warmer, it's yellow, a shade too bright, a G-type star that his cells were already reading and beginning to absorb at a rate that was familiar without being identical. He noted the difference the way a pilot notes unfamiliar runway markings, useful, filed, secondary to the more pressing fact that he had no idea how he had arrived here or where here was. He extended superhearing into the dark and found silence. Not the silence of deep space he knew, with its familiar background hum of Earth's communications threading outward across the light minutes. This was a silence he did not recognize. No emergency frequencies from the Justice League, no Daily Planet radio band, no signal from any receiver he had ever been calibrated to find. Whatever was broadcasting in this part of space, none of it resolved into anything he knew. He turned telescopic vision outward toward the system and found a planet, blue-green, and lit on its far hemisphere by that slightly too warm star. 3 moons in irregular orbits, and between them, moving with the purposeful geometry of something designed to cross light years, a ship. Wide at the forward saucer, narrowing toward twin nacelles, its hull lit by running lights in a configuration he had never seen on any world he had ever visited. It was clearly made, clearly occupied. And its heading was already changing, in a way that told him something aboard it had just noticed the same thing he had, that 2 things that did not belong in the same location were now sharing one. He started toward it, then caught himself. He had arrived at relativistic speed directly toward a ship whose crew had just watched space tear open near their position. He knew what his signature looked like on their sensors. He needed to not be a threat. He approached at a fraction of a percent of his travel speed, close enough now that the ship resolved in detail. The markings on its hull were in a script he did not recognize. The saucer section alone was as wide across as a city block. Whatever civilization had built this, they had built it to last and to intimidate, and the fact that it had not yet fired anything at him suggested they had also been built to wait and see. He stopped 400 meters from the bow and held position, palm raised, and waited. On the bridge of the Enterprise D, the crew watched him do it. Mr. Data. Riker was already standing, already moving toward the tactical station, the red alert call dying on his lips as the contact's deceleration profile came up on the display and declined to match anything in the attack database. Life sign confirmed. Confirmed, Commander. Data's voice carried the specific precision that the bridge crew had learned to recognize as the sound of an android at the outer edge of what its instruments could measure. Biological. Humanoid mass profile. The contact was traveling at 0.97 times the speed of light under its own power, with no apparent propulsion system. It is currently holding station at 412 meters, bearing 011 Mark 7. A pause that lasted exactly as long as a recalculation required. There is an additional reading I must report. The contact's cellular energy density is generating an instrument response I have not previously encountered. My sensors are reading a stored energy output of approximately 140 gigawatts from a single biological organism. Another pause. I have verified the calibration of the instruments. I believe the reading is accurate. Worf said nothing for a moment. Then, shields are already raised. Picard arrived from his ready room in 30 seconds, moving with the unhurried purpose that was his version of urgency, and took in the display and the sensor readout and the visual on the main screen in the same scan. He stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the contact for a long moment. The contact looked back. "Piqua! Stand down from yellow alert," Picard said. "Maintain shields. Hail on all frequencies." The universal translator began its work. 17,000 language matrices, catalogued across 2 centuries of Federation First Contact missions, running in real time on the spectrum of the contact's vocalizations and any carrier signal it might be broadcasting. It found nothing. Unknown. 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 The silence of a language the Federation had never heard. The contact had not moved from its position. It was holding station in hard vacuum at 3 degrees above absolute zero, wearing no environmental protection of any kind, and looking at the ship with an expression that Counselor Troy had not yet been able to classify. "On screen," Picard said, "full resolution. The image that the visual array assembled at 400 meters was clear enough to read the detail on the suit. A man, built like a man in every proportion, wearing a uniform that no Starfleet cultural database had ever indexed. Deep blue with red at the cape and boots, a crest on the chest in angular gold and red that was clearly a symbol of something clearly important. No helmet, no atmospheric ceiling, no life support of any kind. He was standing in open space the way a person stands in a room. The cape drifted in the slow suggestion of a gravity he was generating himself. His face was calm, and the look in his eyes, across 400 meters of hard vacuum, was recognition, not of them specifically, of the fact of them, of what it meant that something this large had been made and sent out into space and was sitting here at yellow alert, hailing him, waiting. He recognized what they were doing because he had done it himself. The language of first contact was the same in every universe he had ever been to. You hold position, you open a channel, you give the other side time to understand that you are not the threat they feared. Counselor Troy spoke quietly from her seat. "Captain, he isn't hostile." A pause. "He's lost." And underneath the resolve there is an enormous grief. Picard held that for a moment before responding. "Open a channel." The contact did something then. Small, simple. He raised one hand open-palmed toward the ship and held it. Then he pointed at the Enterprise directly, a gesture requiring no translation in any known language, in any quadrant, anywhere 2 living things have ever tried to reach each other across a distance neither one could otherwise cross. He was asking. The universal translator was still cycling. The shields held. The crew waited. Somewhere ahead of the ship, the slightly too warm yellow star burned against the dark, and the figure 400 meters off the bow began moving again, slowly and deliberately, in the patient approach of something that has nowhere else to be and intends to arrive in a way that is understood. The world had just changed. No one on that bridge understood yet how much. Okay, real quick, before we go any further, who is the next character you want to see completely run a galaxy that has no business surviving them? Drop the name below. All right, let's see how this goes. Picard considered the transporter for exactly 4 seconds before rejecting it. Data had flagged the issue before the captain could ask. The contact's cellular energy density was registering at approximately 140 gigawatts by current absorption rate alone, and the Enterprise's pattern buffer was designed to handle the dematerialization and reassembly of organic matter within a specific energy envelope. Nothing in that envelope had been engineered for a living organism that functioned at the cellular level like a Starship power reactor. The transporter would lock on. Whether it would deliver the contact in a condition consistent with ongoing biological function was a different calculation, and Data had assessed the probability of a safe transit as uncertain in a range. I am not comfortable specifying to a decimal place. Picard ordered shuttlecraft Goddard prepped and walked to the shuttle bay. Riker fell in beside him in the corridor. Captain, I'd strongly recommend sending an away team first. He came to us number 1. Picard did not slow down. The least I can do is go to him. The Goddard cleared the bay doors and moved through the dark toward the contact, at a speed that was, given the distances involved, almost ceremonially cautious. Picard sat at the forward console with his hands on the panel and watched the figure resolve as the kilometers closed. He had conducted first contact protocols 43 times in his career. None of them had begun like this. The contact was holding station in hard vacuum without any life support Picard could identify, watching the shuttle approach with an expression that reminded him of something it took him a moment to place. It was the expression Picard wore when he was doing the math, cataloging, measuring the gap between what he knew and what he was looking at, and deciding what to do with it. The shuttlecraft stopped. 12 meters separated them. At this range, the suit was fully resolved. Deep blue, red cape drifting, in the absence of any gravity but his own. A crest on the chest worked in angular gold and red, that read as a symbol, in the way heraldry read as a symbol, carrying obvious significance in a language Picard's eye could not pass. The universal translator was still running its 17,000 matrices, still returning nothing. Picard picked up a data PADD and held it to the viewport. 2. A stellar cartography chart of the local sector, the Enterprise's position, marked, the surrounding systems extending for several dozen light-years in every direction. The focus in the figure's eyes was analytical. He was reading the map. He understood what a star chart was and what it was for. Then he pointed, not at any star on the display, not at the system they were in or any of its neighbors, or any region the Federation had charted. He pointed at the corner where the map ended, and the notation simply read, Limit of current survey data. He pointed beyond that edge, at the unmarked space where the chart gave out, and held the gesture. He was not telling Picard he was from some specific location. He was telling Picard that wherever he was from, it was further away than Picard's map had room for. He was telling him the shape of the distance. It was, Picard thought, one of the more precise things anyone had communicated to him in 30 years of service. Tri's voice came over the comm from the Enterprise. She had been reading the contact since the shuttlecraft cleared the bay. Captain! He's telling the truth. He is completely, genuinely lost. Picard set the PADD down. So, what followed was 11 minutes of the most deliberate and methodical exercise in linguistic groundwork that Picard had conducted since the Academy. He pointed at the shuttlecraft and named it. He counted. He named the stars visible through the viewport using their Federation designations. He named himself, repeatedly, with his hand on his own chest. The contact watched the first 30 seconds of this, understood precisely what was being attempted, and joined in pointing at objects from his side of the glass and speaking in a language that the translator received as unknown phonemic data and began haltingly to map. By the 7th minute, the translator had enough baseline phonology to build a skeletal matrix. By the 11th, it had the key. The resolution, when it came, was clean and sudden. The specific snap of a code cracked all at once rather than warmed through. The contact spoke. "My name is Kal-El." A pause. "I am not hostile." Another pause, shorter than the first. "Are you?" Picard had faced the Borg. He had faced Q on a throne of absolute power, had negotiated with species that could unmake ships with a thought, had read the faces of adversaries who had measured the Federation and found it wanting. The question landed with a weight that none of those experiences had quite prepared him for, because none of those adversaries had asked it. "No," Picard said. "I am Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the USS Enterprise. On behalf of the United Federation of Planets, I extend First Contact Protocol." Kal-El looked at him. Something moved behind the composure, something that recognized the formality and did not dismiss it. He said it as if weighing the phrase for a second meaning. "I have done this before." A pause. It didn't usually go this calmly. The Enterprise's sickbay smelled of antiseptic and recirculated air, and Dr. Pesce. Beverly Crusher was, as she was always, precise and unhurried in an examination room. Kal-El sat on the primary biobed and submitted to the instruments with the patient cooperation of someone who expected the process to be strange for everyone involved, but did not intend to make it stranger by refusing it. The first tricorder overloaded, not a gradual degradation, not an anomalous reading requiring manual override. A hard cutoff on the initial pass. Crusher looked at the unit for 1 clinical second, set it aside, and reached for a second. The second tricorder returned cellular energy readings that required manual recalibration before the display could render them in a range. The hardware was designed to show his skeletal density registered beyond the scale's upper limit. His cardiovascular function read at 30 beats per minute, a figure that in any humanoid species she had ever treated would indicate critical bradycardia requiring immediate intervention, and that appeared in him to represent a state of complete physiological rest. Every tissue the scanner could reach was organic, living, structured, with a biological coherence she recognized as the product of evolution and not engineering. He was entirely natural, and entirely absent from the 230,000 species profiles in Starfleet's medical database. Crusher set the second tricorder to continuous monitoring and leaned toward a secondary reading that had been flagging since the moment the sickbay door closed. "Your cellular structure," she said, in the tone she used when a diagnosis was so far outside her prior experience that only precision would do, "appears to be actively absorbing the ambient lighting in this room." She checked the figure again. It had not changed. "You are photosynthesizing from the sickbay's standard lighting array." A pause. "At room temperature." She made a note in the medical log and looked at the tricorder for another moment. "I am going to need a larger sample size." Data was in the corridor when Crusher emerged with the preliminary scan results. He reviewed them, asked 3 clarifying questions, and stood still for slightly longer than a calculation of that complexity strictly required, which was the closest thing to hesitation that anyone on the crew had ever observed from him. Then he found Picard and Worf waiting at the corridor junction and presented his findings. Captain, the visitor's cellular energy density at current rate of ambient light absorption is approximately 140 gigawatts. He held Picard's gaze with the steady attention of someone reporting a fact he had verified and intended to stand behind. This exceeds the rated output of the Enterprise's primary power systems. This individual is, in terms of measurable energy output, functionally equivalent to a main Starship power core. A beat. In biological form, Worf said. That is impossible. Data looked at him. That is, in fact, the result of the measurement. The corridor held that in silence. Behind the closed sickbay door, somewhere between the biobed and the lighting array and the two overloaded tricorders waiting for a category they did not have, the last son of Krypton waited to find out what this galaxy intended to make of him. 36 hours after his arrival, Kal-El was learning to read a Starfleet damage report. Data had taken on the task of orientation with the systematic thoroughness he applied to everything requiring it, which was everything. He had provided a condensed operational lexicon, explained the departmental hierarchy, demonstrated the functions of the primary and secondary systems, and introduced the red alert and yellow alert designations as distinct operational states. Kal-El had grasped the distinction quickly, on the grounds that he had equivalent classifications in his own experience, and only the terminology had changed. He had been cooperative, patient, and almost uniformly quiet. He asked fewer questions than anyone expected from someone who had arrived in an unknown galaxy without a map, which Troy noted in her private log and was not yet sure what to make of. The answer became clear when the conduit alarm sounded. The rupture was in secondary engineering. A plasma conduit carrying deuterium feed to the secondary EPS relay junctions, not catastrophic on its own. But the rupture had caught the adjacent structural plating at a bad angle, and the pressure differential was working on a 30-centimeter stress fracture that the structural integrity field was slow to register and compensate for. Damage control was 1 minute and 50 seconds out. Geordi LaForge had been notified from main engineering and was already running. Kal-El was 12 meters from the breach when the alarm sounded. He moved in less than a second. Not the explosive star-crossing velocity he was capable of, but contained and careful. The motion of someone who had spent 36 hours learning exactly how wide a Starfleet corridor was. He reached the breach, read the situation in the interval between two flickers of the structural integrity field, and placed one hand flat against the torn bulkhead, one hand palm flat. Fingers slightly spread, braced against the full pressure differential of a sealed deck section, he held it. LaForge arrived 90 seconds later, out of breath, repair kit in hand, and stopped in the doorway of secondary engineering. His visor swept the room and returned readings he recognized individually and could not process in combination. The torn conduit, the stress fracture, the structural integrity field fluctuating at the breach point, and a humanoid figure standing against the wall with one palm pressed to the metal, holding a seal that the ship's own systems had not yet managed to fully restore, waiting in absolute stillness for an engineer to show up and do the work. LaForge worked. He did not ask questions. There were no questions that would have improved the situation, and the conduit needed attention before the stress fracture propagated any further. He pulled the access panel, isolated the damaged section, rerouted the deuterium feed, and ran the bypass sequence twice to confirm the seal was clean. 4 minutes and 17 seconds from the moment he arrived. When the structural integrity field re-engaged with a solid reading and LaForge gave the all-clear, the figure stepped back from the bulkhead and looked at the repair with the mild professional interest of someone confirming that a job had been completed correctly. LaForge looked at the wall where the hand had been. No impression in the metal, no stress marks in the plating from the applied force. The alloy surface was completely unmarked. In a voice too quiet to be captured by the deck-level audio logs, LaForge said, "That is not possible." Data reviewed the secondary engineering logs within the hour. He cross-referenced the force output readings against the Enterprise's structural integrity field generator specifications, which were the systems that held the ship together under the combined stresses of warp travel, weapons fire, and gravimetric shear. The comparison required a new scaling unit, because the existing scale did not have a denominator large enough to express the ratio in any form a briefing could use. He brought the PADD to Picard's ready room. "Captain?" He set the PADD on the desk with care. "I believe our initial scaling of the visitor's physical output capacity was insufficient." Picard looked at the PADD. He took his time. "How insufficient?" "The force applied during 4 minutes of static pressure against the breach point exceeded the rated output of the ship's structural integrity field generators by a factor of several hundred." The visitor appeared to find this effort unremarkable. Data paused. "I have revised my upper bound estimate of his physical capacity upward significantly. I have placed an open ceiling on that estimate for the moment. I will specify a figure when I have sufficient data to constrain one." Picard looked at the PADD for a moment longer. He set it down. Indeed, Worf reviewed the same engineering report and said nothing for 27 seconds. Then he found Riker in the corridor outside the security office. "He has not tested his limits once since he arrived." Worf's voice carried the flat precision he reserved for threat assessments. Strict of inflection, stating the observation and nothing more. He held the conduit with a fraction of his power. "I can tell," Riker said. "I can tell the difference between a warrior at full exertion and a warrior being careful. He is always being careful." A pause. "Riker, is that reassuring to you?" Riker considered it. "No, nor to me. It means his full capacity is something he has chosen not to show us." Another pause, longer this time. "I respect that. I do not yet trust it." Late in the ship's night cycle, when the corridors emptied, the observation deck settled into the dim register that passed for darkness aboard a starship. Kal-El stood at the viewport and looked at the stars. He was a solar battery, and this galaxy had suns. He had known this since the first moment his cells registered the slight warmth of this system's star, a fraction hotter than Sol, filling him at a rate that was familiar without being identical. He had filed the information and not followed it to its full conclusion, because the full conclusion was that he could sustain himself here indefinitely, that there was no urgent physical reason he could not stay for a very long time, and thinking that too carefully led somewhere he was not ready to go. Metropolis was not in this galaxy. Lois was not in this galaxy. The Daily Planet, the sound of his city at dawn when the police scanners ran at low traffic, and the light came in from the east at a particular angle across his desk, the specific weight of Clark Kent's glasses in his jacket pocket as a reminder of which face he was currently wearing. He held these things deliberately, the way you held something you were afraid of losing to distance, and felt the edges of them going slightly soft, in a way that frightened him more than anything else had yet in this universe. The distance was not just space. He turned from the viewport. He had work to do. He found Picard on the bridge and asked without preamble, "Captain, what is this galaxy's worst problem?" Picard, who had 3 answers to that question depending on the time scale, gave the honest one for the immediate scale. A Borg cube detected 3 weeks ago is on an intercept course for a populated system approximately 18 light-years from our current position. Kal-El looked at him. Tell me about the Borg. Picard began with Wolf 359 because there was no other place to start that made the scale immediately clear. 39 ships, 11,000 dead. 1 cube. He was midway through an explanation of collective adaptation mechanics, of how the hive mind processed energy weapon signatures and reconfigured drone shielding in real time, of why every solution that had ever worked against a Borg vessel had worked exactly once. Eyes only from Starfleet Command. Picard excused himself. He read the message in the ready room. He read it a second time. He read it a third time slowly now, not for the content which was procedurally correct and unremarkable, but for the transmission header, which carried a routing code that was wrong, in a way the automated verification protocols had not caught. It was a small discrepancy. The kind of discrepancy a person introduced deliberately, counting on the recipient not to know Starfleet Command's transmission protocols well enough to notice. Picard had spent 30 years with those protocols. He sat very still for a long time with the PADD in his hands. He did not call for Riker. Outside the ready room's single viewport, the stars held their positions indifferent, and somewhere 18 light-years ahead, a Borg cube moved toward 800,000 people on a course that was not the thing Picard was currently afraid of. The second message came through proper channels. Formal Starfleet encryption, the Admiralty's routing codes, authentication layers that verified as genuine across every check the Enterprise's communications array ran. Picard read the order in his ready room. He read it a second time. He set it down on the desk and sat looking at it for a while. The order was direct. Maintain contact with the anomalous individual pending classification by Starfleet Command. Do not allow departure from the vessel. And the third clause, which was the one Picard was looking at, the captain was not to disclose the nature of the order to the individual in question. He picked up the PADD. He put it down again. He pressed the CAME. Number 1, I need a moment of your time. Riker arrived in under 2 minutes. Picard handed him the PADD and watched him read it. Riker's expression moved through several things and settled somewhere between resigned and careful. Your orders, Captain. I intend to comply with all but the third clause, Picard said. I will inform you so that you are aware of my decision before I act on it. I will then speak to our guest. He did not look surprised. Picard found Kal-El in the forward lounge, which had become an informal workspace over the past day. He had been going through stellar cartography overlays with Data's assistance, building a working map of Federation space from the point of his arrival outward. He looked up when Picard entered, and the composure on his face was the kind that came from spending decades learning to read the approach of difficult conversations. Captain, he said. Picard sat down across from him. He did not pace. He did not preface. Starfleet Command has asked that you remain aboard the Enterprise while they determine what protocols apply to your situation. That order is legitimate, and I intend to follow it. He held the figure's gaze. I want you to understand that it is an order I was also instructed not to tell you about. I am telling you about it because I believe you are owed honesty, even when the order I have been given does not. Kal-El was quiet for a moment. Is there a reason to be afraid of me? Starfleet believes that anything they cannot measure is something they cannot predict. Picard chose his words with the care he gave to diplomatic correspondence. And anything they cannot predict frightens them, Kal-El said. Yes. Picard paused. That is not unique to Starfleet, Mr. Kal-El. Kal-El looked at him for a long moment, There was no anger in the look, no indignation. What was there was something more considered, as if he were running the geometry of the situation and arriving at a conclusion he had reached before in other configurations. "I'm not going to leave," he said. "I have no reason to. And I don't want to be somewhere that doesn't know what I am, while a Borg cube is 18 light-years away from 800,000 people." Picard studied him. "No, I want to be useful." A pause. "That's what I do." Picard nodded once, with the particular brevity he used when he had assessed a situation and found it satisfactory. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying, and both of them knew it. 3 decks up and 2 corridors aft, in the science lab adjacent to stellar cartography, Data was running a probability analysis on 17 variables related to the Borg cube's intercept trajectory when Kal-El arrived in the doorway and stood there for a moment before speaking. "Data, Kal." Data did not look up from the display. "If you are looking for updated cartographic overlays, I have prepared an additional 47 sectors since this morning's session. If you are here for another reason, I am listening." Kal-El came into the room and stood beside the stellar cartography display, looking at the stars the way he always looked at stars, with an attention that was both completely present and somehow also very far away. "You mentioned yesterday that you are the only positronic brain android in the Federation. To my knowledge, yes, Data. Process the map variables and set them aside. I have spent a considerable amount of time considering what that means for my identity. The conclusion resists resolution." He paused. "Are you finding a parallel?" Kal-El looked at the display. "The last son of Krypton, in a galaxy that had no record of Krypton, I am the only Kryptonian in this universe, possibly in any universe currently accessible to me." He said it without self-pity, which made it, if anything, more precise. "Yes, I'm finding a parallel." Data turned from the display to look at him. "I have arrived at several answers to the question of what my singularity means. I find that I prefer the inconsistency to any premature resolution that would require discarding one of them." He paused in the way he paused when he was deciding whether to say the next thing. "The inconsistency suggests there is more left to understand." Kal-El was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "me too." They stood together at the display for another few minutes, 2 beings outside the taxonomy of their respective worlds, neither one speaking, the stellar cartography turning slowly between them. In the ship's mess hall, 40 minutes later, a Starfleet lieutenant assigned to secondary medical research carried a meal from the replicator to a table near the viewport. The meal was for Kal-El, who had been eating regular food since his first day aboard. As a courtesy gesture, the crew had extended, and he had accepted without comment. The lieutenant set the tray down, excused herself, and walked to the secondary corridor. In the bend of that corridor, she pressed a communicator hidden inside the casing of a personal data PADD and said, very quietly, "Delivery complete." End of an. Kal-El ate the meal. He felt nothing unusual. His Kryptonian cellular structure processed the food through the same biological pathways it always used, and the compound the lieutenant had introduced into the replicator sequence, which had been designed to produce sedation in a standard humanoid nervous system within 8 to 12 minutes, was absorbed into his solar battery function and dissipated as waste heat before it reached any system it was intended to reach. He did not know anything had been attempted. He finished the meal, looked out the viewport at the stars for a moment, and went back to the science lab to resume the cartographic work with Data. In the secondary corridor, the lieutenant waited through 12 minutes, then 20. Then she pressed the communicator again. "Negative effect," she said. "Recommend escalation." She received no immediate response. The channel closed. She pocketed the PADD and walked back to her station in medical research, and Picard, at the other end of the ship, knew none of it. In the neutral zone, in the cold space between Federation and Romulan territory, where neither side committed ships without careful reason, a warbird was already changing course. The intelligence officer aboard the IRW Terex had been monitoring Federation subspace traffic for 11 days as part of a routine signals-gathering rotation. Most of it was routine. The intercept that flagged 3 hours before, the course change was not. It was partial, fragmented by interference from a nearby pulsar. But what survived the interference was enough. An emergency classification, an anomalous biological contact. Power readings that even in their degraded form described a single organism that outclassed anything the Federation's own biological records contained. The Federation was excited. The Federation was also, the officer noted in his report, clearly uncertain what it had. Uncertainty in a strong power was information. It was the kind of information the Romulan Senate Intelligence Directorate paid particular attention to. He filed his preliminary report and watched the Warbird's navigation display update. They were not going to the Federation side of the neutral zone, not yet. They were going to a position from which they could listen better. In the Romulan Star Empire, listening came before everything else. That was how you found out what a thing was before it found out you were watching. 3 days after first contact, the Warbird decloaked off the Enterprise's port bow at a range that was not an accident. The Romulans did this deliberately. They chose their moment with the precision of people who understood that the shape of an arrival communicated as much as any opening statement, close enough that the decloaking quantum signature filled the Enterprise's tactical display at a distance that had shields extending automatically and weapons targeting cycling through its initialization sequence. Not attack range, message range. The Romulan commander had decided that the negotiation should begin with the Federation already inside a reaction it had not chosen to enter. Picard was on the bridge inside 40 seconds. The hailing frequency was already open. The commander on the view screen was senior, precise, and unhurried in the specific way of someone who had prepared her position thoroughly and expected the exchange to be brief. She identified her vessel, cited its current position relative to the neutral zone's coordinates, and stated, in formal Romulan diplomatic register, that the anomalous entity currently aboard the Federation vessel had transited through Romulan-monitored space 17 hours before entering Federation range. Under the terms of the Romulan Star Empire's jurisdictional claims in the region, the entity fell under Imperial authority for purposes of initial classification and evaluation. She expected a transfer to be arranged at a mutually convenient time. It was a claim. Everyone present knew it was a claim. It was dressed in legal architecture and backed by nothing except the Warbird on the tactical display and the 3 minutes of negotiating time the commander had decided to grant. Picard responded in kind. He cited Federation jurisdiction over all personnel and guests aboard Federation vessels. He noted the absence of any documented Romulan jurisdictional claim in the coordinates the commander had specified. He invited substantiation of the 17-hour transit record, which he was confident would not be forthcoming, because it did not exist. The exchange was procedurally precise on both sides and substantively meaningless on one. Picard had conducted enough of these conversations to recognize within the first 90 seconds that the Romulan position was a probe, not a genuine demand, testing how the Federation understood its own situation before committing to an approach. Kal-El had been standing at the back of the bridge since the warbird appeared on screen. He listened. He knew this kind of negotiation. Not the specific vocabulary, but the shape. Polite, procedural language, deployed as a frame around a thing, a way of establishing that the thing in question had no standing to speak for itself, that its preferences and its nature were matters to be resolved between the larger parties in careful, measured language, while it waited to hear what it had been decided it was. He had been discussed this way before. Not often enough. He stepped off the bridge quietly and walked to the external airlock junction at the end of Deck 7's secondary corridor. He found the manual override, applied enough pressure to move it, and waited for the cycling sequence to complete. The action triggered sensor alerts on 4 separate bridge panels. Riker identified the source and said, "He's walked out of the ship." Data had the sensor reading live, confirmed. He is outside the hull, moving away from the Enterprise under his own power, without an environmental suit. Current bearing is directly toward the Romulan vessel. Velocity is increasing. A pause. He appears to be decelerating as he approaches the warbird's outer hull. Contact in approximately 50 seconds. On the view screen, the Romulan commander had stopped speaking. Kal-El reached the warbird at the kind of speed that would have been significant for anything else, and was, for him, a courtesy to the people watching. He braked at the hull with a precision that shed the remaining velocity across 3 meters and placed his left hand against the outer plating of the warbird's forward section. The contact registered on the vessel's structural monitoring system as a load event that exceeded the rated tolerance for any standard docking fixture, landing strut, or external clamp in the warbird's design specifications. The hull did not deform. He was not trying to damage it. He was holding himself in place, in hard vacuum, with one hand against the Romulan warbird's outer plating, and the plating simply accepted the force because he was offering no other option. He had been listening to the Enterprise's communications for 3 days. Every channel, every transmission, every language, the translator decoded and re-encoded in transit. He had a working map of Romulan script in his memory. Now, phonemic architecture and character shapes built from intercepts and the ship's language database files. Not fluency. With his right hand he used heat vision calibrated to a 2 millimeter beam width and a 4 centimeter burning depth. And he wrote in Kryptonian first the angular script of a dead world's language that no one in this galaxy had ever read. Then, beneath it, in blocky Romulan block print, the same 4 words, "I am not a weapon." He turned in the dark and flew back to the Enterprise. In the Romulan commander's command chair, a damage control report was already on her screen. Outer hull plating forward section, contact event logged, thermal engraving detected, depth 4 centimeters. Hull integrity at 100%. No structural compromise. No conduit breaches. A humanoid had written a message into her ship's hull in vacuum, using no instrument her sensor logs had recorded, in 11 seconds. She looked at the report for a long moment. Then she turned to her first officer and spoke quietly enough that the open Federation channel would not carry the words, "This being is not of this galaxy." It has no government to invoke obligations from, no empire to hold hostage against its behavior, no treaties that bind it. There is no lever. A pause, and it could tear this warbird apart without difficulty. As a deliberate choice it has elected not to make, her first officer said, "Your orders, disengage. File to the Directorate. Recommend maximum observation distance. No provocation. No direct contact with the entity." She closed the damage report. "And note that the Federation appears to be navigating this situation with approximately the same certainty we are. The warbird cloaked, the contact signature faded from the Enterprise's tactical display. Open space returned to the region off the port bow, clean and uninformative. Picard found Kal-El on the observation deck 20 minutes later. He had considered what he was going to say during the walk from the bridge. He had decided not to begin with gratitude, because gratitude was not the dominant thing he felt, and Picard had a strong habit of saying the dominant thing. "You ended that confrontation," he said, "but you ended it your way, without consulting anyone." Kal-El was looking at the stars. He turned from the viewport. "Would you have preferred a different outcome?" "I would have preferred to be included in how we reached it." Picard was precise and direct, the way he was direct when the conversation mattered. "You are enormously powerful, Mr. Kal-El, and you have not yet spent enough time in this galaxy to understand how a civilization built on factions and centuries of fragile treaties and carefully maintained equilibrium reads an act like the one you just performed." Kal-El looked at him. As a threat, Picard held his gaze. As a precedent. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had just located the exact place where their two understandings of the same situation did not overlap and were both intelligent enough to recognize it. Outside the viewport, the stars burned on without comment. The argument between them was not finished. It had, in fact, barely started. The distress signal came from a Federation colony world called Bellatus IV, and it was already 7 hours old when the Enterprise's subspace relay picked it up. Kal-El heard it before the translator finished rendering it. He was at the science station, running the stellar cartography simulation data had configured when the super-hearing caught the carrier frequency and held on. His processing of the raw phonemics took 3 seconds before the translator overlay resolved the content. Civilians detained. Infrastructure destruction in progress. 2 Federation colonial observers already injured. Cardassian ground forces conducting what the broadcaster was describing as a punitive action against civilian facilities. He looked at the cartography display. Bellatus IV was on the far side of a debris field, roughly 4 light hours from their current position. Picard was already at the command chair when the duty officer formally logged the call. "Helm, set course for Bellatus IV, maximum warp. Engage." He turned to the science station. "Mr. Kal-El." I heard it. A pause. "How long at maximum warp?" "Approximately 4 hours. The colony had 800 civilians." Kal-El looked at the position marker on the display and did the calculation in the time it took Picard to cross the bridge toward him. He could reach Bellatus IV in roughly 11 minutes, traveling at a fraction below light speed under his own power. He could be there and back before the Enterprise cleared the debris field. Picard had already read the calculation in his face. "You will remain aboard the Enterprise." Kal-El said nothing. Picard stood in front of him and did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice when what he was saying was important enough to hold without it. "I know what you can do, and I need 30 seconds before you make a decision." The Cardassian Union and the Federation have been in active diplomatic process over the status of contested border systems for 14 months. An intervention by an unclassified entity during a Cardassian operation on a disputed colonial holding will be read by the Cardassian government as a Federation-sanctioned military act. The escalation from that interpretation runs through 4 inhabited systems and an armistice that is already under strain. The number of lives in that chain is not 800. Kal-El said, "How many people are on that colony?" "Approximately 800. How many will still be alive in 4 hours?" The bridge was quiet. Picard did not answer, not because he lacked one, but because the honest answer and the position he had just taken could not both be spoken in the same breath, Kal-El did not argue further. He walked off the bridge without announcing it, and was at the airlock junction inside 90 seconds. He opened the manual release, stepped into the cycling chamber, and was in open space before the alert panels had finished registering the breach. The Enterprise's sensors tracked his departure velocity for 40 seconds before the debris field's background radiation swallowed the contact signature. He hit the upper atmosphere of Bellatis IV 11 minutes and some seconds after leaving the hull, shedding velocity across 100 kilometers of thermosphere in a controlled deceleration burn that left a visible pressure column rising from the southern quarter of the colony's watershed. He reconstituted out of the compression wave 50 meters above the colony square and landed without disturbing the stone paving beneath him. The Cardassian ground forces had established a perimeter around the colony's administrative complex. 40 soldiers, 2 weapons emplacements, a field commander with a communication uplink to 3 ships holding orbital position above. They had grouped the 800 civilians in the open square under armed supervision. They had been operating on the reasonable assumption that Starfleet's response would travel through diplomatic channels before it traveled through space. That assumption had approximately 3 hours and 48 minutes of validity remaining when the figure in the blue suit landed in the square. The field commander gave the order to fire. This was the correct decision given the information available. When an unidentified entity of unknown capability appears without a transport or vessel support in a contested operation zone, you fire first. The disruptor bolts hit him and scattered across his skin like light off glass, the energy dispersing without resistance or absorption, leaving no mark on him and no record on the targeting system of anything that could be meaningfully called an effect. He did not move toward them. He placed himself between the Cardassian line and the colonists, and stood there open-palmed and looked at the field commander with an expression that the commander would later describe in his incident report as the most unsettling thing about the encounter. It was patient. The commander fired a second volley. He had to. Anyone would have to. The second volley produced the same result as the first, which was nothing at all. Kal-El raised one hand toward the commander's weapon and used freeze breath in a half-second burst calibrated to the target. The disruptor rifle went cold and locked in under a second, its mechanism seized, the grip icing to the commander's palm before he released it. The weapon clattered to the stone paving, intact, undamaged, just unable to fire. He spoke in Cardassian. 3 days of listening to the Enterprise's translator relay every intercepted communication had given him enough. "You can leave," he said. Now he looked upward through the atmosphere. At the 3 orbital ships, with the telescopic vision that made 30 kilometers of intervening air irrelevant. He could see their positioning thrusters, making micro-corrections, the small simultaneous adjustments of ships running targeting solutions and plotting departure vectors at the same time. They were calculating. The arithmetic they were doing had 2 terms on one side and 1 term on the other, and the term on the other side was a being that their disruptors had just been unable to affect at ground level from multiple emitters in coordinated fire. They calculated for 50 seconds. Then the 3 ships climbed out of their orbital positions and set departure trajectories away from the colony system. The raid was over. Start to finish from his landing in the square, 11 minutes and 22 seconds casualties among the colony's 800 civilians, none. The Enterprise arrived 4 hours later. Pickett beamed to the surface and found the figure in the blue suit, standing at the edge of the colony square with 800 civilians around him in various states of relief and bewilderment. Mass. Picard looked at the scene, looked at Kal-El, and said quietly, "Come with me." The ready room door closed behind them. Picard stated his position without preface. "You may have given the Cardassian Union cause for a diplomatic incident that costs more lives than the ones you saved today. Then those lives die for a treaty," Kal-El said. "I won't do that. That is not your decision to make." "Whose decision is it?" Captain Picard's voice was level. It was always level when he was most serious. "The Federation's, established through process, law, and the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that has survived 500 years of exactly these choices." Kal-El was quiet for a moment, and the 800 people on the ground were in those equations. They didn't seem to feel included. Picard did not answer. He stood at the viewport and did not answer for long enough that the silence became its own statement. Not agreement, not refusal, but the acknowledgement that there was no clean response, and he was not a man who offered dishonest substitutes. Neither of them had lost the argument. Neither of them had won it. That was its own kind of answer. The Cardassian communique arrived 40 minutes later. Riker brought it to the ready room and waited while both of them read it. It was not a protest, not a declaration of diplomatic incident. It was a formal inquiry from the Cardassian ambassador's office, structured and measured, and careful in a way that Cardassian diplomatic correspondence to the Federation had not been in approximately 10 years. They were requesting clarification on the nature and capability profile of the entity Starfleet had deployed at Bellatis IV. They were requesting confirmation of whether the entity operated under Starfleet Command Authority. They were asking in very precise and very careful language whether this was a weapon. Riker said, "They're not threatening us. They're asking if we know what we have." Picard set the communique on the desk. "Tell them the truth," he said. "That is precisely the question we are also asking." The signal arrived at the science station at 0340 ship time, logged automatically by the navigational relay processor as a standard anomaly note from buoy 7 Alpha in the adjacent sector. He did not sleep the way the crew slept. His cellular repair functions operated continuously, and what passed for rest in him was a matter of degree rather than kind. He was at the observation deck when the signal came through, and he caught the harmonic in the same instant the processor logged the primary note. It lasted 43 milliseconds. A frequency embedded in the carrier wave below the threshold of anything the Enterprise's standard sensors were calibrated to detect, riding piggyback on the navigational data like a second language written inside the first. His hearing had recalibrated across 3 weeks in this galaxy. The electromagnetic noise of a spacefaring civilization's ordinary traffic mapped and filed, and what remained was sharper in some frequencies than his own universe allowed. Certain enough, he told no one. This was not how he operated. He had spent 3 weeks being transparent with Picard's crew, answering questions, disclosing capability, offering context he had not been asked for, because concealment seemed like the wrong currency to trade in. But there was an instinct that had served him in Metropolis, a thing learned in years of working a city where every threat eventually gave itself away if you gave it room. When something is baiting you, sometimes the correct move is to walk toward it openly and see who is holding the other end. He filed the harmonic, waited for the beta shift to settle, and left the ship. The coordinates in the embedded signal put the anomaly at 41,000 kilometers off their current course. He covered the distance in under a minute, arriving at the specified location in open space, where there was, as he had expected, nothing visible. He held position and waited. The probe decloaked 11 seconds later. Small, roughly the size of a runabout's auxiliary compartment, automated, modified from a design he had spent enough time in the science lab to recognize as broadly consistent with Starfleet probe architecture. Except the casing bore no markings, the power signatures on its outer panels were inconsistent with anything in the Enterprise's equipment logs. He had 3 seconds to process the discrepancy before it processed his proximity and activated. He felt it the way he always felt it, not pain, a closing. The sensation of the upper registers of himself going dim, like a lamp whose voltage is being steadily reduced. Not off, not yet, but trending. His physical output was still beyond anything in this galaxy's normal catalogue, but the ceiling he could feel in those first seconds of exposure was lower than it should have been, and still falling. The probe's emitter array was producing red sun radiation at a concentration his biology, built for a yellow star, processed as a progressive drain. He had roughly 30 minutes before the degradation became significant. The probe sat between him and the system's primary star. He did not move immediately. He considered the signal and the timing and the specific nature of a device that decloaked only when he arrived at a location no one should have known he would be. The harmonic had not been in a navigational relay's data format and had been routed through the Enterprise's science station specifically. A cloaked runabout appeared 30 meters to his left, 3 figures in environmental suits. No insignia on the suits, no markings on the runabout, but the way they moved when they disembarked into the vacuum, the specific, trained economy of Starfleet zero-gravity protocols, was not something you could remove by taking the insignia off. He had spent 3 weeks watching Starfleet officers move. He knew the body of a Starfleet officer when he saw one. They deployed a stasis field first. Correct tactical sequence, immobilize before any other intervention. Even at reduced capacity, he walked through it in 3 paces. He froze the first operative's weapon with what remained of his freeze breath. Slower than usual, less precision at the edges, but the hand holding the weapon was immobilized cleanly enough. The weapon spun away into the dark. He lifted the second operative off the ground with one hand. He did not squeeze. He never squeezed. He held the figure clear of the vacuum with the same measured pressure he used to handle equipment he did not want to damage. The third operative had stopped moving. He looked at her. He looked through the faceplate, through the suit's collar ring, to the communication badge, clipped to the undersuit's inner lining. Starfleet issue. The kind of badge physically coded to its wearer's biosignature, registered in the approved supply chain. No insignia on the suit. But the badge was standard issue, real. Section 31 left no paper. He had understood that from context, from the things Picard had not said when the Priority 1 message with the wrong routing code arrived. They operated in the spaces between documentation, in the distance between what the record showed and what had actually occurred. But in the field, Starfleet equipment was what they had. He set the second operative down. He turned to the probe. His heat vision at current output was less surgical than usual, a wider margin of error, slightly reduced burn intensity, but the probe was not designed to survive a direct application of even that reduced output at close range. He cut it apart in 11 seconds. The emitter array went cold. Red sun radiation ceased. He turned to face the system's primary star and waited. 90 seconds. The cellular charge climbed back through functional range. At 140 seconds, the upper registers opened again, the full spectrum of himself returning like a tide coming in. He had never had to wait for it like this before. Not in a galaxy where the star above him was not guaranteed. He filed that away. It was important. He returned to the Enterprise. He found Picard in the ready room, which had become, over 3 weeks of observation, the place Picard went when something required thinking that the bridge's open configuration made difficult. He sat down across the desk and described what had happened in the order in which it had occurred: the harmonic in the navigational signal, the coordinates, the probe, the operatives, the communication badge inside the collar ring. He did not editorialize. He stated the sequence as facts, with the same economy he used when reporting sensor readings to data, as if what he was describing was information the captain needed and not a thing that had been done to him. Picard listened without moving. "I want to be clear," Kal-El said. "I am not leaving because of this. I am not going to do anything about it. I am telling you because you deserve to know what kind of organization you belong to." Picard's expression had not changed in the way that expressions sometimes do not change, because the person wearing them is holding it deliberately. "I know what kind of organization I belong to," he said. "I also know what kind of organization they are not supposed to be." He picked up a PADD from the desk. He turned it once in his hands without looking at it. "I will file a report. I will not be able to prove it. They will have left no evidence. I know." A pause. "I've dealt with people like this before. They're afraid. I understand why." Kal-El stood. He looked at Picard for a moment. "Captain, thank you for being honest with me from the beginning." A shorter pause. "It matters." He left the ready room. The door closed behind him with the quiet, mechanical certainty of a well-maintained ship. Picard sat at his desk with the PADD in his hands. He would file the report. It would go into a system that had, on prior occasions involving Section 31 activity, produced no documented outcome. He would file it anyway, because the alternative was to be the kind of captain who did not, and there were things he had held on to across 30 years of service that he had not always been able to justify to everyone who had asked him to release them. Picard set the PADD down. Outside the viewport, the stars continued, indifferent. The visitor was somewhere aft, moving through a ship that had just tried to neutralize him, and he was staying. The thing closest to hope in Picard was this, that it had not changed the answer. The contact appeared on long-range sensors at 0610, and every Starfleet officer on the bridge who had served after 2367 recognized the shape before data spoke. Picard saw the display. His hand found the arm of the command chair. His grip closed on it once, briefly, and then his voice was steady and precise and gave away nothing that the shape on the screen did not already tell anyone watching his face. Red alert, all hands to battle stations. Data's report came without inflection, which was its own kind of mercy. Confirmed Captain Borg Cube, bearing 274, Mark 3-1. Intercept course for the Arrandis colony system. Estimated arrival, 6 hours at current velocity. 6 hours, 800,000 people on Arrandis. Worf's tactical station cycled through its targeting calibrations. Riker looked at the view screen. Troy said nothing. There was nothing to say about a contact like that which the display was not already saying. Kal-El was at the science station. He looked at the shape on the view screen, then at Picard. "I'll go now." "You will not." Picard stood. His voice carried the quality it had when an order was not a request and was not going to become one. "My ready room." The last Kryptonian in this galaxy followed the captain off the bridge. He explained the Borg the way he explained things when they were the worst he knew, precisely without editorializing, in the sequence most likely to produce understanding rather than urgency. Every energy weapon you use, they will adapt to after the first 3 or 4 shots. Every shield frequency we broadcast, they recalibrate against. There is no sustained firepower solution to a Borg cube. Every solution that has ever worked against them worked exactly once. Kal-El said, "My heat vision is an energy emission. They will classify its radiation frequency within seconds and adapt around it. Picard held his gaze. You said, my heat vision. What else? A pause. I can punch things. Picard looked at him for a moment. That has never been an option we had available. Physical force. They can't adapt to physical force, not a question. No, they cannot. Picard placed his hands flat on the desk. But the cube is over 3 kilometers on a side, and the drones aboard it, potentially tens of thousands, were living beings before the collective took them. Each one was at some point someone. That stopped the visitor in a way that Romulan warbirds and Cardassian orbital ships had not. He stood at the desk and looked at Picard with an expression that went still and did not speak. Picard said quietly, Now you understand why Wolf 359 cost 39 ships and 11,000 lives and produced no decisive result. The figure in the blue suit nodded once and left the ready room. Picard sat at the desk and looked at the tactical display until Riker's voice came over the comm. He's outside, Captain. Picard walked back to the bridge and did not order anyone to bring him back. Superman reached the cube's intercept position, 11 minutes ahead of the Enterprise. He came in at a velocity that was by any reasonable measurement a weapon. Not the full acceleration he was capable of, but a sustained flight approach that carried his mass at a fraction below light speed and delivered it to the hull of a Borg cube with a force that reshaped metal. He did not lead with a fist. He used his shoulder, and the impact tore a section of outer plating inward in an event that had no medium to carry its sound and still registered on the Enterprise's sensors as a major structural failure. The cube shuddered. For approximately 1 second, nothing else happened. Then the tractor emitters responded. Dozens of them distributed across the cube's surface geometry, locking on the figure at the breach with enough combined force to hold a starship at station. They held him for 2 seconds. He tore free in the third and turned to find the cube's weapons systems cycling. The first volley hit him broadside. He absorbed it. The second volley hit, and he absorbed that too, the cellular conversion of the radiation running at the comfortable efficiency of a system designed to drink starlight. On the third volley, the beam frequency began to shift, not all at once, but in increments, the collective processing his absorption pattern and adjusting the output in real time. By the fourth shot, the beams were skewing around him, finding angles his physiology processed differently. He stopped using heat vision. He used his fists. Each impact at near flight velocity delivered kinetic force to a hull that had no adaptive protocol for it. The hull tore. Corridors opened to vacuum. Interior spaces exposed themselves in sequence as he worked along the cube's outer surface, punching and tearing at plating that could stop Federation phases and could not stop him. The cube was enormous, 3 kilometers on a side. He was one figure working a surface the size of a city district. The first drones came through the breach he had already made. Dozens, then more, moving through the torn corridor. In the specific uniform way the collective moved. No hesitation, no self-preservation, no individual assessment of risk. They came with arms forward and tubules extended, the assimilation apparatus that had ended 39 ships and 11,000 lives. Physical contact, drive the tubules in. The first array hit his forearm and snapped. The drone processed the result with the expression of a machine encountering an output outside its parameters. The second drove its tubules into his shoulder, and those snapped too, the Kryptonian skin under full solar charge, returning nothing. Impervious in a way, the Borg had not classified and could not yet model. A third drone broke its arm against his chest. The collective processed this instantly and distributed the result to every drone currently aboard the cube. They did not retreat. The collective updated its method and sent more. He moved through them with restraint, and that restraint cost him. Not throwing them, not striking them, lifting each one aside with the controlled precision of someone unwilling to use his full capacity against beings who no longer had any capacity to choose. He held this discipline against hundreds of drones, each one a former person the collective had taken and converted into an instrument. He moved them. He did not break them. Every decision to hold back cost seconds he did not have. Then the comm opened. Kal-El Picard's voice carried the specific gravity of a captain reporting a tactical fact he wished he did not have to report. They have us. He looked through the cube's hull with the vision that made kilometers irrelevant. The Enterprise, 2 kilometers off the cube's port face, caught in a tractor beam running from an emitter cluster on the cube's upper quarter. The ship was holding station at full impulse and not moving. "I see it!" He began moving toward the emitter. A voice filled the cube's internal systems, distributed through every speaker in the corridor network, unhurried, carrying the flat and absolute certainty of something that had never needed to raise its voice, because raising a voice was a behavior it had catalogued and set aside. "Your physical resistance is noted," the Borg Queen said. "We are adapting our approach." He reached the tractor emitter and cut it apart in 4 seconds. The beam on the Enterprise released. A second tractor emitter activated on the cube's lower quarter. The beam re-engaged. He moved toward the second. A third activated before he reached it. A fourth registered on the Enterprise's sensors before he destroyed the third. The collective distributed the emitter activation pattern across 43 separate nodes, positioned at intervals across the cube's geometry. None of them capable of holding him, all of them requiring time to reach and time to destroy. The Borg were not trying to stop him. They were learning to delay him. 800,000 people on Arandis had 5 hours and 38 minutes remaining. He moved through the cube's interior, not as an invader sweeping through a target, but as something methodical, following the geometry of data's transmitted analysis, which came through the communicator in 30-second bursts in the gaps between the Borg's jamming sweeps. Data had identified probable hive node locations based on structural density readings and Starfleet's existing catalog of cube architecture. He was following a map drawn from the outside of a structure he was inside of and adjusting as the structure revealed itself to be different from the map in several significant ways. The drones were everywhere. They moved through the cube's corridors the way water moved through a medium. No individual initiative, no tactical spacing, no hesitation at obstacles. They came toward him in the continuous uniform flow of things directed by a single will, and he moved them. He lifted them aside, placed them against walls, set them down in corridors behind him where they would take time to reorient and follow. He did not throw them. He applied the minimum force to move a body without permanent damage. The same calculation he had made 1,000 times in Metropolis, when the bystander was in the wrong place, and the available solutions included several that he was not willing to use. He would not kill what was once a person. He would move it out of his way. The Queen's voice came without announcement, distributed through the cube's speaker network, not the broadcast Picard had mentioned with something close to contempt, the reflexive declaration designed for species that had the capacity to be frightened by it. This was directed. She was speaking to him. "You are not like the others." Not a greeting, a data point. He kept moving. "Your biology is unclassified. Your strength is unscaled." A pause. "Your adaptability is remarkable." Another pause. briefer. You will be assimilated. You've tried that, he said, not stopping. We have not yet tried everything. The voice moved with him through the corridor network, following him with the ubiquity of something that required no physical location to be present. The beings you are moving aside so carefully that one was a science officer aboard a Federation starship. She specialized in xenobiology. She had a daughter. A different drone crossed his path. He redirected it with one arm. That one was a teacher on a colony near Rigel Zevon. He taught children to read in 2 languages. A third came at him. He placed it against the wall and held it there until the corridor cleared. That one served under the command of Jean-Luc Picard. Before the word sat in the cube's air and occupied the space of several other words. You cannot destroy us without destroying them, the Queen said. That is not your weakness. That is your nature. We have catalogued it. He stopped for 3 seconds, not to think. He had thought it through before he entered the cube. He stopped because the weight of what he had said deserved 3 seconds. Because the teacher who had taught children to read in 2 languages deserved 3 seconds. And because what he was about to say should not sound as if it had been prepared. I know I can't save them today, he said. I know that. He kept moving, but I can stop you from taking anyone else. Data's analysis placed the primary hive coordination node within 40 meters of his current position, deeper into the core where the biomechanical density of the walls was greatest. He tore through 2 bulkheads at the intersections and found it. 8 meters across. Crystalline computing substrate threaded through biomechanical circuitry in a lattice that had no equivalent in Federation engineering, because Federation engineering had never tried to build a structure that was simultaneously a machine and a living tissue and a thought. It hummed at a frequency his hearing had been filtering since he entered. The local mind of this cube specifically, the structure that coordinated this cube's full drone population as a single operational unit. Not the Queen, who was distributed across the collective and anchored nowhere. This was the mind of this vessel. Remove it, and this cube's drones would still be alive, still connected to the broader collective in theory, but locally uncoordinated. The commands would reach them and find nothing intact to execute them. He took hold of the node with both hands. The drones in the corridors froze. Not physically, their bodies continued momentum mid-stride, but the coordination behind the motion had stopped. They stood in the cube's passages in the specific stillness of machines awaiting a command that was no longer arriving. 300,000 units, a local collective experiencing signal without a receiver. He ripped the node free. The tractor beams on the Enterprise released simultaneously. Every emitter cluster on the cube's surface went dark, the tractor network dropping from its active count to 0 in the time it took the bridge to register the change. He came out through the breach he had made, entering back into the vacuum between the cube and the ship, and turned to watch. The cube's movement had changed. Not a purposeful vector, not an organized tactical withdrawal. A drift that became a heading as the broader, collective reasserted partial control from outside the vessel. It was turning away, not fast. On the Enterprise's bridge, Riker stood at the center of the room and watched the contact signature track away from the Arendis system and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "It's running." Worf did not respond immediately. His jaw set. "It is running." Riker looked at him. "Have you ever said that before?" Worf looked at the tactical display. "No." A pause. "I have never had cause to." "Yeah," Riker said. Aboard the retreating cube, in the distributed consciousness, threaded through the collective's vessels across the galaxy, the Queen opened a new classification file and held it open. Species unknown. Cellular designation. Kryptonian. Assimilation ineffective at current approach. Tubule injection fails at full solar charge. Physical force immunity confirmed. Energy weapon adaptation confirmed effective. Primary documented vulnerability, solar dependency, G-type stellar radiation required for peak function, recommended acquisition approach, solar deprivation protocol. Time required to develop sufficient emitter array for targeted deployment, not recorded because the collective did not record numbers it considered too small to merit notation. The file stayed open. The Borg were patient. The Borg were always patient. That evening, ship's night, the Arrondis system receding safely in the aft sensors, Worf found Riker in the corridor outside the security office. Commander. Riker looked at him. Worf was quiet in the way. He was quiet when he had not yet determined how to say what he had already determined to say. He went into a Borg cube alone. He came out. He did, Riker said. He did not kill a single drone. Worf's voice was flat. Not flat in the way it was flat when he was suppressing something, but flat in the way a measurement was flat, stating a fact of record. Inside a Borg cube, where the alternative to killing is assimilation, where every Starfleet officer who has ever entered a Borg vessel has either died or been taken, he did not kill a single being. Riker said nothing. In the Klingon tradition, Worf said, the measure of a warrior is not what they can destroy. He looked at the stars beyond the corridor viewport. It is what they choose not to destroy, when they could. He stood there for a moment longer. Then, he is worthy. He said nothing else and walked away down the corridor, and Riker stood in the silence he left behind and thought about hope, about what it required to carry hope into a Borg cube and bring it back out intact, and what that said about the being who had done it. 2 days after the Borg engagement, in the hours between ship's midnight and the first watch of the morning, the figure in the blue suit sat on the hull of the Enterprise. He did this when he needed to think, not the observation deck, not the forward lounge, not any space the ship offered with walls and lighting and the ambient warmth of recycled air. He went outside, into the vacuum, and sat on the hull plating at the saucer's edge and watched the warp field fold the stars into lines of light that had no equivalent in any sky he had ever stood under. It was not Earth's sky. It was not a sky at all. It was something this galaxy did to light at velocities that should not have been possible, and he found it, against all expectations, beautiful. Picard had reached him via communicator 40 minutes earlier. They had been talking about nothing specific, about Starfleet's founding, about Earth's eugenics wars and the century that followed, about what a civilization looked like when it had survived its own worst instincts and was still deciding if it had survived them well enough. The visitor listened with an attention that asked better questions than most people's prepared ones. Q appeared between them without ceremony. No courtroom. No flash of light. He was simply present, seated in a lawn chair that had not been on the hull a moment before, wearing a Starfleet uniform he had given himself, with the casual appropriation of someone who had decided the formality suited the occasion. He was looking at Superman with the complete, unhidden attention of a being that had encountered something it had not expected to encounter. He did not look at Picard at all. That alone told Picard something. The not looking was information. Picard's voice came through the communicator, very dry. Q, not now, Picard. Q kept looking at Superman. You made a Borg cube run. He said it without theatrics, which was the most theatrical choice available to him. In 38 years of watching this quadrant, I have never seen a Borg cube run from anything. He tilted his head. What are you? My name is Kal-El. I know your name. I read your molecular structure the moment I decided to arrive. I read every sensor log on this ship while I was deciding where to sit. Q leaned forward. I'm asking what you are. A pause. You are not a god. I know all the gods. You are something else. He studied the figure the way someone studied something that had no category yet. A mortal who has, without knowing it, become the answer to a question I have been asking for longer than you can calculate. What question? Whether it is possible, Q said, to be powerful and humble. Not as a performance, actually. The warp stars burned at the edges of the hull. Q stood from the lawn chair. You fight. You serve. You refuse to rule. You went into a Borg cube and declined to kill what was once a person. He gestured at the streaked light beyond them. There are 50 billion species in this galaxy who will live and die whether you act or not. You saved one colony. One cube retreated. The collective remains. The Cardassian Union remains. The galaxy is entirely unchanged. Yes, Superman said. Q paused. That is your answer, yes. Yes. I saved those people. The galaxy is unchanged. Both things are true. Then what is the point? He was not slow to answer because he lacked one. He was slow because the answer had weight, and he gave it its time. I was there in the moment. I was there. I could choose. That choice is not nothing. Then he shifted the way practiced. Arguers shifted when the ground was firmer than expected, not retreating, but finding a different angle. I act within my power, he said. I have flung starships across this quadrant. I have stopped wars. I have arranged the fates of civilizations more times than you have had sunrises. They call it interference. They resent me for it. He gestured between himself and the figure on the hull. You act within your power. You stop a raid. You save 800 people. They call you a hero. What is the difference between your goodness and mine, except scale? Superman held Q's gaze for a long time. Then, you believe you know better. Every time you act, you believe your judgment is correct, and the outcome you choose is right. A pause. The difference is, I could be wrong. I know I could be wrong. That is why I never stopped listening. That is why I stayed on this ship after they tried to trap me with a Red Sun probe. And I could have left without consequence. He looked at Q. Do you know you could be wrong? Q did not answer. The silence on the hull lasted longer than silences usually lasted around Q. He stood in it without filling it, which was, in itself, something Picard had not witnessed in 8 years. Then Q looked at Superman, not with assessment, not with the cataloging focus of a being evaluating a specimen, but with something older than that. Something that Picard, listening through the communicator, might have called recognition if he had been willing to extend a word that generous to Q. Then Q said, very quietly, Neither do I. He did not snap his fingers. He did not gesture. He made no speech and left no remark. He was simply no longer on the hull. Picard's voice came through the communicator, and it was not entirely steady. That is the first time in 8 years of his attention that I have seen Q leave without a performance. A pause. What did you say to him? I told him I knew I was fallible. A longer pause on the other end. That would do it. They came back inside. Picard poured 2 cups of tea in the ready room, Earl Grey, extended without asking, and they sat across the desk and had the argument that the Bellatis IV confrontation had started and never finished. Picard made it precisely. You saved the colony. 800 people are alive who might not have been. And 800 people now know that a being exists who can solve problems they cannot solve themselves. What does that cost them? Over time, their agency, their willingness to reach for the next solution when you are not there to reach it for them. Or it buys them the time to learn how, Superman said. That is a decision you made for them. Superman was quiet. He looked at the desk between them, at the steam from the cup, at the space where the answer he usually had was not quite arriving in its familiar form. "You're right," he said. He said it without qualification, without the small protective clause that would have made it easier to say. I don't know if I would make the same choice again. I might. But you're right that I owe them more than my certainty. Picard looked at him for a long moment. He did not say he agreed. He did not say he disagreed. That, he said, is the most honest thing a person in your position has said to me in 30 years of first contact. Neither of them found this entirely satisfying. Both of them found it honest. Both of them found it, in a specific way of things that are honest, more useful than satisfaction would have been. Outside the Ready Room viewport, the warp stars continued. The argument between two frameworks for the same question, what goodness cost and who had the right to spend it, had not resolved into a clean answer. It had resolved into two people who had heard each other in the way of the best arguments. That was enough. The Federation Council's formal analysis of the Borg engagement ran to 47 pages across 3 classified briefings, the first 2 of which contradicted each other on the question of whether the outcome represented a strategic opportunity, and the third of which concluded that it was both, and that both implications deserved separate ongoing assessment. The unofficial consensus, which circulated through 3 Admiralty offices in the week after the engagement, was more economical. A single individual had forced a Borg cube to change course. No Federation vessel, no Allied fleet, no weapons system in 300 years of Starfleet history had produced that result. The tactical implications were significant, ongoing, and generated a 4th briefing that was not shared with the Council. The second implication, quieter, harder to file under any existing heading, was this: they had tried to use him. He had found out he had stayed anyway. 3 separate admirals in 3 separate briefings on 3 separate days wrote the same question in the margins of their analyses and did not include it in any formal record. What did that mean? The question did not have an easy answer, which was why it stayed in the margins. The Federation had spent 500 years building a framework for engaging with the unknown. First contact protocols, diplomatic process, the accumulated jurisprudence of a civilization that had encountered several thousand other civilizations. None of that framework had a provision for an individual who outclassed its military capacity, had already declined to use that advantage, and had demonstrated a grasp of Federation principles that several of its own officers could not match on their best days. Picard, whose report on the engagement was the most thorough document in the Admiralty file, had written 2 words at the end of it: trust him. Nobody in the Admiralty had written anything in the margins of those 2 words. Picard filed his Section 31 report on a Thursday for the 4th time. The same facts in the same sequence, the same absence of evidentiary documentation the operatives had been careful to leave behind. He sent it into the system and waited 40 seconds for the receipt confirmation, and then closed the terminal. He told Superman this in the corridor outside the science lab. "You know it will disappear," Kal-El said. "I know. Why file it?" Picard considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I am a Starfleet officer, and I believe in process, even when process fails." He looked at Superman. Especially when it fails. A pause. You understand that, I think. Better than you might expect. Kal-El looked past Picard at the small viewport at the corridor's far end, the stars holding their positions outside. In my world, there are people who try to control me, too. They're afraid, and they have resources, and they are very smart. I understand why. Fear is not the same as malice. He looked back at Picard. Keep filing. It matters that someone keeps filing. He nodded once and said nothing else because nothing else was required. Data had delivered his report on the dimensional rupture 3 days after the Borg engagement in the science lab, standing at the display with the care he gave to findings he had verified thoroughly. He described 16 theoretical approaches to reconstructing a return vector. He described how he had eliminated 14 of them and why. The remaining 2 required energies on the order of the quantum singularity at the galactic core, which made them accurate as mathematics and unreachable as engineering. They are therefore not operationally viable, Data said. He paused in a way that was longer than the pause, a calculation of that length required. I am sorry. He said it with the gravity of someone who had learned that sorry was a word you said when you had done everything available, and the outcome remained insufficient, and was still deciding carefully what the word felt like from the inside. Kal-El looked at the display. At the 16 approaches, the 14 eliminated lines, the 2 that ended at a number no available power source could approach. Don't be, he said. You looked. Data processed this. He did not speak for a moment. Then he saved the complete analysis to his personal research file, unprompted, and did not explain why. 3 days after that, Picard brought Superman to the ready room for the last formal conversation. He laid out the facts without preface, because preface would have been a kindness neither of them needed. The visitor could not return home by any currently known method. The Federation had no legal or diplomatic category for his situation, not a refugee, not a foreign national, because the foreign nation did not exist within any jurisdiction any Federation court could reach. He had no documentation. He had no formal standing. You asked me when you first arrived what this galaxy's worst problem was, Picard said. You have since encountered a Romulan jurisdictional claim, a Section 31 operation, a Cardassian raid, and a Borg cube. You handled each of them through restraint and principle. He held Superman's gaze across the desk. You once said that wanting to understand this galaxy before acting further on, it was the most Starfleet thing anyone had said to you who was not in Starfleet. You said you agreed. Superman said. Picard opened the desk drawer. He set a folded Starfleet uniform on the desk between them. He did not add anything to the gesture, because adding anything would have diminished them both. Kal-El looked at the uniform. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone deciding, but the quiet of someone marking the weight of what they had already decided. He picked it up. That evening in the ship's gymnasium, Worf found Riker mid-workout and sat on the bench beside him without asking. Riker looked at him. Worf was quiet in the way he was quiet when he had made a determination and was deciding whether it needed words. He is worthy, Worf said. Riker set down what he was holding. Of what? Worf looked at him for a moment. He stood and left. Riker sat with the silence, and then he started laughing. Quietly, without volume, the specific laugh of someone who has had something explained to them with complete efficiency and found the explanation exactly correct. He knew what Worf meant. He agreed with all of it. The subspace message from Deep Space Nine arrived the following morning. Audio only, no accompanying text, duration 41 seconds. The voice was direct and unadorned, in the way of someone who had decided formality was the wrong register for what they had to say. "Captain Picard has briefed me," the voice said. "I've been told you went into a Borg cube by hand and made it leave. I've been told you understand the word restraint, which is the part I'm more interested in." A pause shorter than the first. "When you get a chance, Deep Space Nine. The doors open." Kal-El read the transcript twice. He had a working map of the Federation's spatial geography from weeks of stellar cartography. Deep Space Nine in the Bajoran sector, at the mouth of a stable wormhole, connecting this quadrant to the Gamma Quadrant. He did not know what was waiting on the other side of that wormhole. He did not know what a Starfleet officer with Cisco's record and Cisco's tone was thinking about when he sent a message like this. He filed the message and went to find Picard. There was a briefing at 0900. He intended to be in it. The Enterprise was on a heading Picard had charted with particular care. A yellow dwarf system ahead, uninhabited, 40 minutes at current warp, not the destination. A stop built into the course for a reason that appeared in no official mission log, but that every senior officer on the bridge understood without being told. The man in the new Starfleet uniform needed time under a yellow star before the next assignment began. The assignment was a first contact mission, a pre-warp civilization in a system 3 days' travel from their current position, developing faster than Starfleet's initial survey had projected. The prime directive question was already complicated. A world aware enough to be looking for signals, but not yet aware of what a signal might bring back. Picard wanted Superman present. Not to act, to observe. To learn the shape of the question you did not yet have the right to answer, and to understand, from the inside, why restraint was not the same as indifference. Kal-El was on the observation deck. He had been there for 40 minutes, in the new uniform that did not quite fit, because no uniform had ever been designed for him, watching the stars through the wide viewport. He had seen warp from outside, flying beside starships, feeling the edge of the subspace distortion at the warp bubble's boundary. He had never seen it from inside before. From inside, the stars became lines. The light became something that was not quite either of those things, only visible correctly from this angle at this speed, from within the thing itself. He watched it the way he had watched sunrise over Metropolis from a rooftop on mornings when the police scanner was quiet and the city was still deciding what kind of day it intended to be, as a thing that was simply real and worth the attention of someone who was here to see it. He was still here. This was, in itself, a choice he had made again every morning. Since the day the spare uniform landed on the desk between them. Not once, every morning. The grief of the distance was still there, the specific, patient weight of a man who knew exactly what was on the other side of the dimensional gap and had no way to reach it, and he held it the same way he held everything that could not be fixed, present, acknowledged, not set down, and not dropped. The warp stars did not care about the grief. They were what they were, light stretched into lines by a galaxy that had its own rules and had no particular obligation to make them easy. He had learned to find this clarifying rather than indifferent. He thought about hope, not the symbol on his chest, Kryptonian script, that meant the word and also several things adjacent to it. The translation did not fully carry. The actual thing the symbol was pointing toward, the choice. Not the certainty, not the guarantee, not the confidence that the outcome would be what it needed to be. The choice, made each time in full knowledge of what it cost. He was a long way from home. He was not going home. He was here, on a ship, going somewhere it had never been, in a uniform that had been offered and accepted without ceremony. And the first assignment was not a war or a crisis, but a question he did not yet know, enough to answer. Learning the question was the assignment. Learning the question he was discovering harder than any of the other things he had done in this galaxy. He was choosing to do it anyway. Picard came to the observation deck 20 minutes before the yellow dwarf intercept. He stood beside the viewport without requiring conversation, and they watched the warp stars together for a while, which was one of the ways Picard preferred to approach the things he intended to say. "Q will be back," Picard said. "I know. He always returns when something holds his attention." A pause. "I have the distinct impression he intends to revisit your conversation." "Good." Picard looked at him. "You want to talk to him again?" I gave him a real answer. Kal-El watched the light at the edge of the viewport where the warp field bent the star lines into curves. "That doesn't happen often enough." He glanced at Picard. "For either of us, I think." Picard considered this. He found that it was, as the visitor's observations generally were, entirely and characteristically honest. He did not deny it. They stood at the viewport until the yellow dwarf system's primary resolved from a line into a point at the edge of the field, steady and warm, and the navigator's course adjustment registered in the warp harmonics underfoot. Picard watched the star grow and thought about first contact missions, about how many he had conducted, and how none of them had ever included a member of his crew who had once made a Borg cube change course, and had since spent 3 weeks asking careful questions about civilizations he did not yet fully understand. He thought about the specific value of being willing to not know. He thought about Q and what it meant that Q had left without a snap. He did not say any of this aloud. Some assessments were complete in themselves. Somewhere in the galaxy not close, not yet. In the distributed consciousness threaded through 10,000 vessels on 1,000 headings, the Borg Queen had a designation file open. The file held everything the cube's drones had recorded. Physical force metrics, solar energy readings, cellular density profile, behavioral analysis of a being that could be impaired only by sustained deprivation of stellar radiation. The emitter array required to generate sufficient red sun emission at scale in deep space was large. It required ships in specific orbital configurations, it required planning, it required time. The Borg Collective, it had plans, it had, above all else, time. They were not building something new. They were refining what they knew. They were always refining what they knew. The acquisition priority at the top. Read maximum. The Queen closed the interface. Somewhere cubes were already moving. The Enterprise dropped from warp for 11 minutes at the edge of the yellow dwarf system and then returned to warp on the heading for the first contact assignment, carrying its crew and its new member toward a question none of them could yet answer. From the outside, the ship was a streak of blue light in the dark between stars. Inside it, on the observation deck, a man who had no home in this galaxy stood watching stars he had learned the names of several weeks ago, wearing a uniform that had not been made for him, carrying a symbol on his chest that had the same meaning in every language the universal translator had ever resolved. Hope not the absence of danger, not the certainty of winning, not the promise that everything would be all right, just the choice, made again every day, in full knowledge of what it might not be enough for, to be here, to remain, to listen and then to act when the listening was done. He was here. For now, and for now was enough. All right, now that we've watched a Borg cube turn around and run, I genuinely need to know, who is the next character you want to see go absolutely feral in a universe that has no business surviving them? Drop the name below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing it. I read every single one. And if you want more crossovers like this, hit the like button and subscribe.